He had everything, but he'd never known true love. But when the pure young woman entered his life, the millionaire discovered all his money meant nothing. Where are you watching this from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happened between them will make you believe in the impossible. The morning light crept timidly through the fogged windows of the flower shop, painting golden rectangles across the damp petals of freshly cut roses. Grace plunged her hands into the bucket of cold water, feeling the chill climb up her forearms as she arranged the stems of white carnations that had just arrived from the fields outside Somerville. The wall clock, an antique pendulum mechanism that Grandma Rose had bought at an estate sale in Savannah more than 40 years ago, read 7:15 in the morning. Outside, downtown Charleston awakened with its daily ritual. The bakers on King Street had already fired up their ovens before dawn, and the aroma of fresh biscuits competed with the perfume of jasmine that permeated every corner of Charleston during this June season. From a nearby balcony, a guitar rehearsed the opening chords of a blues melody, while neighbors exchanged morning greetings from their windows, adorned with flower boxes of azaleas. Grace dried her hands on the linen apron inherited from her grandmother and contemplated the small kingdom that was now hers. Rose's flowers occupied a narrow but deep storefront, with walls painted a mint green that her mother had chosen 30 years earlier, when she still dreamed of a future with the father Grace had never known. Dark wooden shelves held pots of all sizes, and from the ceiling hung dried bundles of lavender and magnolia leaves that perfumed the air with notes of southern countryside. Martha arrived punctual as always, pushing the glass door open with her hip while balancing 2 cups of coffee from the corner cafe. "Morning, honey. Brought you breakfast because I know you haven't eaten a thing." Grace accepted the cup with a tired smile. The circles under her eyes betrayed another sleepless night, another dawn spent reviewing accounts that never quite balanced. "Thanks, Martha. You didn't have to go to the trouble." "Trouble," she says. The woman set her purse on the counter and tied her apron with movements practiced over decades. "I've been working in this flower shop since before you were born. If I don't take care of you, who will?" It was a rhetorical question that contained an uncomfortable truth. Grace had no one else. Her mother had passed away when she was 17, leaving her with a business on the brink of bankruptcy and a grandmother whose health deteriorated with each season. When Grandma Rose departed 3 years later, Grace found herself completely alone, heir to a legacy of flowers and debts that weighed like stones on her young shoulders. The door chime rang at 8:45, announcing the first customer of the day. Grace looked up from the counter where she was preparing pending orders and felt time stop for an imperceptible instant. The man who had just entered didn't belong to this world of narrow streets and weathered balconies. His impeccably cut suit, a dark charcoal that seemed to absorb the light, contrasted violently with the colorful chaos of the flower shop. Italian leather shoes gleamed like mirrors, and his watch caught flashes of sunlight streaming through the window. But it was his eyes that captured Grace's attention, a deep blue like the Atlantic on a calm day. They carried a melancholy that contradicted the opulence of his appearance. "Good morning," he said, and his deep voice resonated in the small space like the echo of a distant bell. "I need a floral arrangement, something special." Grace wiped her hands instinctively, conscious of the dirt stains under her nails, of the rebellious strands escaping her braid, of the simple cotton dress that had seen better days. "What's the occasion?" she asked, taking refuge in professional protocol. The man seemed to consider the question longer than necessary. His eyes traveled across the shelves filled with flowers, stopping at the jasmine bouquets Grace had placed that very morning at the entrance. "To remember," he finally responded. "To remember something I thought I'd forgotten." There was something in the way he pronounced those words that made Grace feel an inexplicable shiver. It wasn't a common response, not the type of order she usually received. Customers asked for flowers for birthdays, anniversaries, funerals, declarations of love. Nobody asked for flowers to remember. "Please have a seat," she offered, gesturing to the small stool by the counter. "Tell me more." Alexander Bennett wasn't a man accustomed to being told what to do. For the past 10 years, since he'd taken control of Bennett Investments after his father's accident, he'd given orders, made decisions affecting thousands of employees. negotiated million-dollar deals in boardrooms across 3 continents. However, something in this young woman's voice, something in the simplicity of her invitation, made him obey without question. He sat on the stool while Grace began moving among the flower buckets with a natural grace that mesmerized him. Her fingers, stained green and brown, selected stems with a precision that revealed years of practice. Occasionally, she'd bring a flower to her nose, close her eyes for a second, and either return it to the bucket or add it to the arrangement taking shape. White roses represent the purity of memories, she explained as she worked. Wild rosemary was used in ancient times to strengthen memory, and jasmine. She paused, caressing the small white petals with reverence. Jasmine is the soul of Charleston. Its perfume can transport you to any moment of your life with just one breath. Alexander watched her work, fascinated by the passion emanating from each of her gestures. In his world of numbers and strategies, he'd forgotten there existed people capable of finding poetry in the everyday, of converting a simple flower bouquet into a declaration of meaning. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Grace. Grace Mitchell." "Grace," he repeated, as if savoring each syllable. "Like the virtue." She smiled, and it was as if the sun had decided to shine more intensely inside that tiny shop. "My grandmother was very fond of saying that Grace could save any situation. She said if she named me Grace, I'd have a life full of second chances." "And have you?" The question hung suspended in the air, loaded with a meaning both perceived without being able to name. Grace felt her cheeks flush as she finished tying the bouquet with a natural raffia ribbon. "Here you are," she said, avoiding the answer. "I hope this helps you remember what you're looking for." When their hands touched as she passed him the bouquet, something awakened in Alexander's chest. A forgotten sensation, an echo of a feeling he believed buried beneath layers of responsibilities and disappointments. He looked at Grace, really looked at her for the first time, and saw in her hazel eyes a purity he hadn't found in any of the perfectly made-up and strategically positioned women who populated his world. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, pulling out his wallet. $20. He left a $100 bill on the counter. "Keep the change and thank you." He left the flower shop before Grace could protest, leaving behind a trail of expensive cologne and unanswered questions. She stood staring at the closed door for a long moment, with the crumpled bill in her hand and her heart beating at a strange rhythm. Martha emerged from the back room where she'd been listening to the entire conversation. "That was Alexander Bennett," she said in a conspiratorial tone, "owner of half the financial district and 3 factories in Colombia. They say he's the most sought-after bachelor in the Carolinas." Grace shook her head, putting the bill in the register. "Well, he won't be back. Men like that don't return to places like this." But she was wrong. 3 days later, the black Mercedes parked in front of the flower shop again, and again the next day, and the day after that. Without knowing it, destiny had begun weaving its invisible web, uniting 2 souls the world would never have considered compatible. Because true love doesn't understand social classes or bank accounts. It only recognizes those who are destined to meet, no matter how many obstacles stand in their way. The following weeks passed between flowers and silences charged with meaning. Alexander had developed an inexplicable need to visit the flower shop, finding increasingly elaborate excuses to justify his presence. "I need yellow dahlias for my office reception," he'd say on a Monday. "Orchids for the boardroom," he'd argue on Wednesday. "A bouquet for my mother in Atlanta," he'd explain on Friday. Grace prepared each order with the same meticulous care, explaining the properties of each flower, sharing stories she'd learned from her grandmother about the secret language of petals. Alexander listened with an attention that surprised them both, asking questions, taking mental notes, finding in those conversations a refuge he didn't know he needed. "Did you know that sunflowers always face the light?" Grace asked one afternoon, while preparing an especially vibrant arrangement. "My grandmother said they're the most optimistic flowers that exist. No matter how dark the sky, they always seek the sun." Alexander watched her from his usual stool, with a cup of sweet tea that Martha had begun serving him automatically at each visit. "And you, Grace, do you also seek the sun?" She stopped working for a moment, her hands still on the green stems. "I try," she answered with sincerity. "But sometimes the clouds are very thick." There was a vulnerability in her voice that Alexander recognized as his own. He too knew those clouds, those days when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, when the loneliness of success felt more overwhelming than any failure. "May I take you for coffee?" The words came out before he could stop them. "I know a terrace by the Battery, with views of the harbor. The sunset from there is—" "I don't think that would be appropriate," Grace interrupted, feeling her heart accelerate against her will. "You're a customer and you what? You can't have coffee with someone who enjoys your company?" Grace sought help from Martha, but the woman had conveniently disappeared toward the back room, humming a tune with feigned innocence. "Mr. Bennett." "Alexander," he corrected. "Please, we've been talking about flowers and meanings for weeks. I think we can use first names." She sighed, leaving the half-finished arrangement on the counter. "Alexander, then." His name on Grace's lips sounded different, warmer, more real. "We don't belong to the same world. You drive cars that cost more than everything in this shop. I can barely pay rent each month. Money doesn't define who we are." "That's very easy to say when you have it." The silence that followed was dense, charged with uncomfortable truths. Alexander put the cup on the counter and stood up, approaching the space where Grace remained motionless. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't know your struggles. I don't know what it's like to worry about rent or whether there'll be enough customers tomorrow. But I know other forms of loneliness, Grace. I know what it's like to be surrounded by people who only value you for what you can give them. I know the weight of expectations I never asked for. And in these weeks in this small flower shop that smells of jasmine and magnolia, I've felt more peace than I have in years." Grace looked up, finding in Alexander's blue eyes a sincerity that completely disarmed her. There was no arrogance in his gaze, not the condescension she expected to find, only a tired man, searching for something money couldn't buy. "Coffee," she finally yielded. "Just coffee." The smile that lit up Alexander's face was the most beautiful reward Grace had received in a long time. That first date, if it could be called that, took place on a hidden terrace in the French Quarter, away from curious eyes and sharp tongues. They talked for hours, discovering unexpected similarities beneath their superficial differences. Alexander told her about his childhood on the family estate, about a demanding father who measured love in academic achievements, about a mother who compensated with overprotection for what was lacking in paternal warmth. Grace shared her own memories, afternoons learning the flower trade alongside her grandmother, evenings of jazz in the clubs of the historic district where her mother worked as a seamstress, the promise she'd made to Grandma Rose to keep the flower shop alive even if the world crumbled around her. "Why is it so important to you?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. "You could sell the shop, get a more stable job." "Because it's all I have left of them," Grace responded with a broken voice. "Every time I walk through that door I feel they're still there, in the smell of the flowers, in the walls they painted, in the secrets they taught me. Selling would be like losing them again." Alexander felt a knot in his throat. He who had inherited an empire had never thought of his legacy in those terms. For him, the company was a responsibility, a burden he carried out of obligation. But for Grace, that small flower shop was a sanctuary of love and memory. The sun was beginning to descend over Charleston Harbor when they finally said goodbye. Alexander walked Grace to the door of the flower shop, where the orange light of sunset painted long shadows on the cobblestones. "Thank you for this afternoon," he said. "It's been a long time since I felt so present." Grace smiled, and in that gesture was something new, a confidence that didn't exist hours before. "Thank you, Alexander, for reminding me that not everyone is as I imagined. Will you have coffee with me again? Maybe, if you find a good excuse to buy more flowers." He laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised them both, and walked away toward his car with the feeling that something fundamental had changed in his life. Grace watched him leave, her heart divided between hope and fear, not knowing that this afternoon marked the beginning of a journey that would transform everything they thought they knew about love and about themselves. The first obstacle arrived, disguised in glossy paper and golden letters. Grace found the magazine forgotten on the counter one August morning, when Charleston's heat turned every movement into a Herculean effort. The cover showed Alexander at a charity gala, his perfect smile directed at the camera, his arm around the waist of a spectacular woman. Victoria Ashford Montgomery was everything Grace was not: tall, elegant, with a surname that appeared in Virginia history books and a fortune that rivaled the Bennets. The headline read, "Wedding of the Year." The Bennett and Ashford families could unite in a corporate merger that would shake the markets. Grace felt the floor open beneath her feet. The weeks of conversations, shared coffees, looks that said more than words, vanished like dew under the morning sun. She'd been a fool, naive to let herself dream of something impossible. "You shouldn't believe everything you read in those magazines," Martha said, taking the publication from her hands. "They're specialists at making up stories." "But the photo is real, Martha. Look at them. They look perfect together." "So what? Hasn't he been coming here every week for the past 2 months? Hasn't he spent entire afternoons talking to you like nothing else in the world existed?" Grace shook her head, tears threatening to overflow. "That doesn't mean anything. For men like him, people like me are entertainment, a curiosity. In the end, they always return to their world." For 3 days, Grace immersed herself in a silence that alarmed everyone who knew her. She worked mechanically, preparing arrangements without her usual passion, avoiding the window facing the street for fear of seeing the black Mercedes park in front of the door. She ate barely enough to stay on her feet, and nights were spent awake, torturing herself with images of a future that would never be hers. On the 4th day, when the sun had already set and Grace was preparing to close the shop, the door burst open urgently. Alexander entered soaked from head to toe without an umbrella, his suit ruined and hair plastered to his forehead. He'd been running, that was evident, probably from the streetcar stop on Meeting Street. "Grace," he gasped, searching for air. "I need to explain." She instinctively stepped back, putting the counter between them as a protective barrier. "There's nothing to explain. I saw the magazine." Magazines lie. Half of what they publish is speculation, the other half convenient lies. "And the photo? Is that also a lie?" Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for a painful confession. "The photo is real. The event was real. Victoria is real." He paused, seeing how Grace's face hardened. "But what the magazine doesn't say is that night I told my mother in front of all the guests that I wouldn't marry Victoria or any other woman chosen for me." The silence that followed was so dense, Grace could hear her own heart beating erratically. "What?" "My mother had been planning that marriage for years. It was the perfect arrangement, the merger of 2 empires, the strategic move that would consolidate our power on the East Coast. But 3 months ago, something changed. I walked into a flower shop in downtown Charleston, looking for flowers to remember, and I found something I didn't know I was looking for." Grace felt her legs tremble. She leaned on the counter, unable to process what she was hearing. "Alexander, you can't have done that. Your family, your company, my family will have to accept it, and the company will survive without that marriage, as it survived all this time." He approached slowly, rounding the counter until he stood facing her. "Grace, I've spent 35 years doing what was expected of me. I studied the degree my father chose. I assumed the role they imposed on me. I attended events where I didn't want to be. I smiled at people I despised. And during all that time I felt empty, like I was living someone else's life." The tears Grace had contained for days began rolling down her cheeks. "And what changed?" "You," he answered simply. "Your way of talking about flowers as if they were poetry. Your laugh when Martha tells her neighborhood stories. The passion with which you defend this place. This legacy that for anyone else would be just another business. You reminded me that beauty exists in simple things, that success isn't measured in financial statements, that love." His voice broke slightly. "That love exists outside of contracts and strategic alliances." Grace raised a trembling hand and placed it on Alexander's wet cheek. He closed his eyes at the contact, as if that touch were the most valuable thing he'd received in his life. "I'm afraid," she confessed in a whisper, "afraid of not being enough for your world. afraid of losing you when you realize who I really am." "Then we'll be afraid together," he responded, covering her hand with his. "Because I'm afraid too, Grace, afraid I don't deserve you, afraid my world will destroy you. But I'd rather face those fears with you than continue living an empty life without you." The first kiss came as an inevitable consequence, like rain falling after days of heavy clouds. It was delicate at first, tentative, exploring new and sacred territory, but it soon transformed into something deeper, more urgent, charged with months of contained tension and unspoken words. When they finally separated, both had tears in their eyes. The aroma of jasmine mixed with the smell of rain entering through the cracked door, creating a perfume neither would ever forget. "And now what?" Grace asked, her forehead resting against his. "Now we learn to build something together, without rushing, without expectations, without the weight of what others expect from us. It won't be easy. I know, but things that are worthwhile never are." Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, giving way to a starlit sky that promised a new beginning. Inside the small flower shop in downtown Charleston, two people the world had considered incompatible discovered that true love doesn't understand classes or fortunes. It only recognizes souls that are destined to meet. The months that followed were a delicate dance between two realities that seemed irreconcilable. Alexander gradually introduced Grace to his world, starting with dinners at discreet restaurants in Mount Pleasant, where anonymity allowed them to be simply two people in love. But the crystal walls separating their worlds soon made themselves visible. The first crack appeared during a charity event at the Gaillard Center, which Alexander insisted they attend together. Grace spent 3 weeks saving to buy an appropriate dress, a simple black silk design she found in a second-hand shop downtown. She felt beautiful when she looked in the mirror that night, with her hair pulled back in a low bun and pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. But the moment she entered the center's lobby, she knew she'd underestimated the chasm separating her from that world. The women around her wore jewelry costing more than an apartment, designer dresses whose labels she couldn't pronounce. The men talked of investments and acquisitions, private jet trips and properties in Hilton Head. "You look stunning," Alexander whispered, squeezing her hand affectionately. But Grace saw the sideways glances, the discreet whispers behind champagne flutes. "Who is she?" "They say she's a florist from downtown." "What a scandal for Catherine." Alexander's mother's name circulated among the guests like a warning. Catherine Bennett Carlyle was a legend in Carolina business circles, a woman who'd kept the family empire afloat during the 5 years her husband had been in a coma, who'd multiplied investments while others sank in the recession. An iron matriarch whose approval was more coveted than any $1 million contract. "Your mother will never accept me," Grace said during intermission, taking refuge in a secluded corner of the foyer. "My mother doesn't have to accept you. I've chosen you, and that's all that matters." "Alexander, don't be naive. Your world operates with rules I don't understand. Marriages of convenience, strategic alliances, surnames that open doors. I have none of that. You have something more valuable. You have authenticity. You have a kindness that in my world is as rare as water in a desert." The words were beautiful, but Grace was beginning to understand that love by itself isn't always enough to tear down walls built over generations. The second crack appeared a week later, when Jennifer, Alexander's executive assistant, showed up at the flower shop with a proposal Grace found deeply disturbing. "Mr. Bennett asked me to help you with some improvements," the woman explained, an impeccable 40-year-old executive who looked at the shop with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised disdain. "Etiquette classes, image consulting, perhaps some sessions with a communications coach." "Alexander sent you to turn me into someone else? To help you adapt," Jennifer corrected, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The events you'll be attending require certain knowledge." Grace felt the air become thick, unbreathable. "Tell Alexander that if he wants to talk to me about this, he can come himself. And also tell him I don't need anyone to teach me to be someone I'm not." That night, the argument between them was the first of many. Alexander tried to explain he only wanted to protect her, make things easier. Grace accused him of treating her like a project to improve, not as an equal. Don't you see that by trying to prepare me for your world, you're saying I'm not enough as I am? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, that I need classes to learn to use the right fork? That my way of speaking isn't refined enough for your associates? Alexander's silence was more eloquent than any response. Grace grabbed her purse and walked out of the restaurant where they'd met for dinner, leaving him alone with the check and the certainty he'd made a terrible mistake. For 3 days they didn't speak. Grace worked at the flower shop with an almost frantic intensity. Preparing arrangements for weddings and events celebrating loves she was beginning to doubt really existed. Martha watched with concern, not daring to intervene. It was Alexander who finally appeared at the door, without his executive suit, without his luxury car, dressed in jeans and a simple shirt that made him look 10 years younger. "You were right," he said without preamble. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who changed to please me, who said what they thought I wanted to hear, who molded themselves to my expectations. And when I found you, someone genuine, someone who didn't need anything from me, I tried to turn you into the same thing I'd always despised." Grace put down the scissors she was using and looked at him, waiting. "I don't want you to change, Grace. I want to learn to see the world the way you see it. I want you to teach me what's truly important, because clearly I've been looking in the wrong direction for too long." The words were sincere. She could see it in his eyes, but fear didn't disappear so easily. "And your mother? And your world? What will happen when they have to choose between accepting me or losing you? Then they'll have to make that decision, and if they lose me, it'll be their choice, not mine." Grace sighed, feeling the tension of the past days beginning to dissolve. "This isn't going to be easy, Alexander. There will be more moments like this, more clashes between who we are and what the world expects of us. I know, but I'd rather face those battles with you than live an empty peace without you." They embraced among the flower buckets, with the aroma of jasmine enveloping them like a promise. Outside, the Charleston sun began its descent toward the harbor, painting the sky in oranges and pinks that rivaled the most beautiful flowers in the shop. The path ahead remained uncertain, full of obstacles they couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time both felt they had the strength to face it together. Autumn arrived in Charleston with a cool breeze that relieved memories of the scorching summer. The leaves of the live oaks began to turn, and the rhythm of the flower shop intensified with orders for the season's celebrations. It was on one of those October afternoons that Alexander appeared with a proposal that would change the course of their story. "I found a property," he announced, laying out plans on the counter. "Right next to the flower shop. The owner is willing to sell." Grace studied the documents with a furrowed brow. "It's huge. 4 times the size of my shop." "Exactly. You could expand the business, create your own greenhouse, maybe a floral design school, everything you've always dreamed of." "Alexander, this must cost a fortune. I can't let you." "It wouldn't be a loan," he interrupted. "It would be a gift. No conditions, no strings. Everything in your name." Grace felt the ground move beneath her feet. It was too much, too big, too generous, too frightening. "I can't accept this." "Why not?" "Because it would change everything between us. Because it would make me someone who owes you something. Because if this ever ended, I couldn't look you in the eye knowing I built my dream with your money." Alexander remained silent for a moment, processing her words. Then slowly he took the plans and put them back in his briefcase. "I understand," he finally said. "You don't want to owe me anything." "It's not that." "No, Grace, I really understand, and you're right. My way of expressing love has always been through material things, because it's the only thing I learned. My father expressed his approval with checks, my mother with jewelry and trips. I never knew another way." He sat on the stool he already considered his own, his shoulders sunken with a vulnerability Grace had rarely seen in him. "Then teach me," he continued. "Teach me how to love you the way you need, because I don't want to lose you for not knowing how to do it right." Grace knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "Love isn't proven with gifts, Alexander. It's proven by being present when things get difficult. It's proven by listening, respecting, growing together. It's proven in the small daily gestures that no one else sees." "Like what?" Like the mornings you come help me unload flowers from the truck, even though you arrive in your executive suit and end up covered in dirt. Like the nights you stay late listening to my stories about grandmother, even though you've probably heard them 100 times. Like the way you look at Martha when she tells you about her grandson, with a tenderness you don't show in any of your business meetings. Alexander felt a knot form in his throat. I didn't know that meant so much to you. It means everything, Alexander. Because in those moments you're not the heir to an empire or the businessman featured in magazines. You're simply you, the man who chose to walk into a flower shop in Charleston and stay. That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Alexander began rethinking everything he thought he knew about love, about giving and receiving, about what truly mattered in life. And Grace, for her part, learned that accepting help didn't mean losing independence, as long as that help came from respect and not condescension. Weeks later, it was she who brought up the subject of the property again. I've been thinking, she said one evening while they ate shrimp and grits on the flower shop's patio. Maybe we could find a way to do the property thing that works for both of us. What do you have in mind? A partnership. You provide the initial capital, I provide the knowledge and work. We split the profits, assume the risks together. If it works, we grow together. If it fails, we fail together. Alexander smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated his tired features. Miss Mitchell, are you proposing a business arrangement? I'm proposing an adventure, Mr. Bennett. Do you accept? I accept. Though I should warn you that my usual business partners don't make me feel half as excited as you do. They laughed together, with that complicit laugh of those who share a secret. The air smelled of magnolia and promises, and the October full moon illuminated the patio, where jasmines continued to bloom despite their season having passed, as if they knew they were witnessing something special. The decision was made. Together they would build something new, something that wouldn't belong only to one or only to the other, but to both equally. It was an enormous risk, a leap of faith toward an uncertain future. But as Grace had learned from her grandmother, the most beautiful flowers are those that grow in the most unexpected places. The day Grace officially met Catherine Bennett remained etched in her memory as one of the most intimidating experiences of her life. The Bennett family estate rose on the outskirts of Beaufort, an ancestral property with whitewashed walls and centuries-old oaks that had witnessed generations of triumphs and tragedies. Alexander had prepared her for days, describing his mother with a mixture of love and caution that said more than any explicit warning. Catherine was a 72-year-old woman who ran the family empire with a surgeon's precision, who had survived the most devastating losses without shedding a tear in public, who considered weakness the most unforgivable sin. You don't have to impress her, Alexander had told her the night before. Just be yourself. But being herself was precisely what Grace feared. In a world of labels and protocols, her authenticity could be interpreted as awkwardness, her simplicity as poverty of spirit. Lunch began with a formality that made the air seem denser. Catherine presided over the dining room table with a queen's elegance, her dark eyes evaluating Grace's every movement with an intensity that felt almost physical. "My son tells me you're a florist," she said, breaking the silence as servants served she-crab soup. "An interesting profession." "My family has been in the business for 3 generations, Mum. It's more than a profession for me, it's a legacy." "A legacy," Catherine repeated, savoring the word. Interesting choice of terms. Do you know what it means to maintain a legacy, Grace? The weight of expectations, the impossible decisions, the sacrifices. I know the weight of keeping alive something others built before me, ma'am. Of getting up every day knowing that if I fail I disappoint not just myself, but everyone who came before. Something changed in Catherine's expression, a flash of recognition that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "My husband built this empire over 40 years, the matriarch continued. When he fell ill, many expected everything to collapse. They thought a woman couldn't hold the helm. I proved them wrong. I know, ma'am, your story is known throughout the Carolinas. Not many would have had the strength to do what you did. Strength isn't a choice, dear. It's a necessity. When everything depends on you, there's no room for weakness." The second course arrived, shrimp and grits with country ham, a traditional recipe Grace immediately recognized as her grandmother's version. "This is delicious," she commented. "The secret is in the grits, isn't it? They must be stone ground, cooked slowly." For the first time, Catherine showed something close to a genuine smile. "We've been using the same mill for decades. My mother-in-law insisted it was the only way to get the proper taste." My grandmother said the same thing. She had a small garden behind the flower shop where she grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. She said plants grown with love taste different. The conversation turned to gardening, neutral ground where both women could meet without the barriers of class and expectations. Grace spoke of botany, with a passion that illuminated her face, explaining cultivation techniques, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. Alexander observed the exchange with silent amazement. He'd never seen his mother show genuine interest in the words of someone outside her circle, never seen her listen without judging. After lunch, Catherine invited Grace to walk through the estate's gardens. Alexander made to accompany them, but his mother stopped him with a look that brooked no opposition. "I want to get to know this young woman alone," she said. "Go back to the study, you have pending calls." The walk through the gardens was revealing. Catherine walked with slow but sure steps, occasionally stopping to point out specific plants or share anecdotes about the estate's history. "These gardens were designed by my mother-in-law 60 years ago," she explained. "Every tree, every shrub was chosen with a purpose. Beauty and functionality, that was her philosophy." "It's beautiful," Grace murmured, genuinely impressed. "Though if you'll permit the observation, ma'am, some of these plants need urgent attention. The azaleas in the south wing show signs of chlorosis, probably from overwatering." Catherine stopped, looking at her with an expression Grace couldn't interpret. "The gardeners I hired didn't mention anything. With all respect, ma'am, gardeners who work for large estates often fear contradicting their employers. But plants don't lie. If you look at the yellowing leaves with green veins, you'll see the characteristic pattern of iron deficiency caused by excess moisture." "And what would you suggest?" For the next hour, Grace walked through the gardens pointing out problems and proposing solutions. Catherine listened attentively, asking occasional questions, making mental note of each observation. It was a strange dynamic, the downtown florist advising the matriarch of one of the Carolinas' most powerful empires. When they returned to the main house, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. "Grace," Catherine said, stopping at the door, "I'll be honest with you. When my son told me about you, I assumed you were just another fortune hunter, one of the many who've tried to get close to him over the years." Grace felt her cheeks burn. "Ma'am, I never—" "Let me finish." Catherine's voice was firm but not hostile. "Today I saw something different. I saw genuine passion, deep knowledge, and most importantly, integrity. You didn't try to impress me with what you thought I wanted to hear. You were honest even when that honesty could make me uncomfortable." "I was just being myself, Mom." "Exactly. And that, in my world, is extraordinarily rare." Catherine extended a hand, and to Grace's surprise, squeezed her arm with something resembling warmth. "I'm not giving you my blessing, not yet. But I'm giving you the opportunity to prove who you really are. Don't waste it." When Alexander found Grace in the entrance hall, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What happened? What did she say?" "She gave me an opportunity," she replied. "And I don't intend to waste it." Construction of the new space began in early November, transforming the abandoned lot next to the flower shop into a hive of activity. Grace supervised every detail with an energy that surprised everyone who knew her, combining her artistic vision with a pragmatic determination Alexander hadn't suspected. The plans had evolved from the original idea. It wouldn't be simply an extension of the flower shop, but an integrated floral arts center. There would be a climate-controlled greenhouse for growing delicate species, a workshop for classes and events, a small cafe overlooking the garden patio Grace was designing personally. "It's ambitious," Martha commented one afternoon, watching workers raise the metal structures. "Your grandmother would be proud." "Or terrified," Grace laughed. "She always said small and safe was better than big and risky. But she also said the most beautiful flowers are those that dare to seek the sun." Grace smiled, remembering her Grandma Rose's many contradictions, a woman who preached caution while living with overflowing passion. Alexander, meanwhile, found himself navigating turbulent waters in his own world. The decision to invest in a downtown flower shop when he should be closing million-dollar deals in New York or Boston had generated uncomfortable rumors in business circles. "They say you've lost your way," his cousin Marcus informed him during a board meeting, "that a woman has you under her spell. They say many things, most of them from the same people who've been hoping for years that I'd fail so they could take my position. Alexander, I'm not against you. I'm just warning you. Emotional decisions in business rarely end well." "This isn't an emotional decision, Marcus. It's the first decision in a long time that I'm making because I want to, not because I have to. And if that costs me the approval of people who've never mattered to me, it's a price I'm willing to pay." The tension in the company manifested in subtle ways: sidelong glances in meetings, veiled comments in hallways, passive resistance to his directives. Alexander felt the weight of collective disapproval, but also a strange freedom in not yielding to it. It was during one of those difficult weeks that the Floral Center project faced its first crisis. Municipal permits, which should have been routine, stalled in a bureaucratic maze that smelled of sabotage. "Someone pulled strings," explained the lawyer Alexander had hired for the project. "I can't prove it, but the obstacles we're encountering aren't coincidental." Grace received the news with a calm that surprised everyone. "There will always be people trying to stop us," she said. "The question is whether we're going to let them succeed." "And what do you propose?" "Do it the old-fashioned way, the way my grandmother would have done." Over the following weeks, Grace went through the downtown neighborhood house by house, shop by shop, explaining the project, answering questions, listening to concerns. It was exhausting work that left her feet aching and voice hoarse, but each conversation added another ally to her cause. Neighbors who had known her grandmother, merchants who bought flowers for their window displays, families who celebrated their important moments with arrangements from Rose's Flowers. All of them became voices pressuring City Hall to unblock the permits. "It's incredible," Alexander commented, watching a delegation of neighbors show up at the municipal offices. "I've spent fortunes on lobbyists and political consultants, and you achieve more with a cup of sweet tea and a sincere conversation. People power, Mr. Businessman," Grace smiled. "Something your advisors will never understand." The permits arrived 2 weeks later, accompanied by an official apology for the administrative delays. Nobody mentioned sabotage, nobody pointed fingers, but the message was clear. Grace Mitchell had deeper roots in downtown Charleston than her enemies had calculated. The celebration was modest: a dinner on the flower shop's patio with Martha, some close neighbors, and a bottle of cold champagne someone had brought from Colombia. Alexander, sitting among people who weeks before would have been complete strangers, felt a belonging he'd never experienced in his exclusive private clubs. "To Grace," Martha toasted, raising her glass, "and to Grandma Rose, who's surely watching from somewhere and smiling." "To Grandma," everyone echoed, and Grace felt tears blur her vision. That night, when the guests had left and the silence of the sleeping neighborhood enveloped the patio, Alexander and Grace sat under the stars, fingers intertwined, and the aroma of jasmine wrapping around them like a blanket. "You know what's strangest about all this?" he murmured. "What?" "That for the first time in my life, I feel I'm exactly where I should be. Not because someone told me, not because it's what's expected of me. Simply because here, with you, everything makes sense." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, feeling his heartbeat through his shirt. "My grandmother used to say that love is like the roots of a tree. You can't see them, but they're what holds everything up. Your grandmother was very wise. She was. And I think she would have loved you very much." They stayed like that until dawn began painting the sky pink and orange, two people who had found in each other the home they'd always sought. The Floral Center was just the beginning of something much bigger, a life built together, stone upon stone, flower upon flower, day after day. The crisis arrived without warning, as catastrophes that change the course of lives tend to arrive. It was a January morning when Alexander received the call he'd been dreading for years. The numbers didn't add up, investments that should have been safe had turned into losses, and the empire that generations of Bennetts had built teetered on the edge of the abyss. The problem had begun months earlier, with a series of decisions made by a partner in New York who turned out to be less honest than his credentials suggested. Diverted funds, inflated contracts, investments in phantom projects. When the auditors uncovered the magnitude of the fraud, the damage was already incalculable. Grace found Alexander sitting on the floor of his apartment at 3 a.m, surrounded by documents scattered like fallen leaves after a storm. The vulnerability on his face was so raw, so heartbreaking, that she felt her own heart break. "I am going to lose everything," he murmured without looking up. "Everything my father built, everything my mother fought to maintain. It's going to collapse and it'll be my fault." Grace knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands to force him to look at her. "You're not going to lose everything, and it's not your fault. You trusted someone who didn't deserve it, but that doesn't make you responsible for their betrayal. I should have seen it. The signs were there, but I was so distracted with us, with the project, with everything that wasn't work that I didn't see them. Don't you dare blame us for this." Grace's voice was firm, almost severe. "Don't you dare turn the best thing that's happened to us into an excuse to flagellate yourself." Alexander looked at her, surprised by the intensity of her response. "Grace, I'm about to lose a company worth millions. How can I what? Keep perspective? Because money, Alexander, all that money you're talking about isn't what makes you valuable. It's not what made me fall in love with you. It's not what truly matters." The tears began rolling down his cheeks, tears he hadn't shed in years, that he'd learned to suppress since childhood because Bennetts don't cry. Bennetts solve problems. Bennetts never show weakness. "I'm afraid," he confessed, and it was as if those 2 words released something that had been contained too long. "I'm afraid of disappointing you, of disappointing my mother, of proving everyone who doubted me was right." Grace embraced him, feeling the sobs shake his body, letting him cry everything he needed to cry. There were no words that could fix the situation, no magic solutions to offer. She could only be there, present, holding him while the world crumbled around him. The following days were a whirlwind of emergency meetings, calls with lawyers and accountants, sleepless nights searching for solutions where there seemed to be none. Grace insisted on accompanying him to every meeting, on being present even though she didn't understand the financial jargon, on being his anchor when everything seemed to be sinking. "You don't have to be here," Alexander told her one night, exhausted after another day of bad news. "This isn't your problem. Your problems are my problems now. That's how this works. But the floral center, the shop, your life, my life is you, Alexander. Everything else can wait." It was Grace who had the idea that would change the course of the crisis, watching how large investors closed their doors, how banks denied credit, how traditional partners fled like rats from a sinking ship. She proposed something that seemed crazy to everyone. "The small downtown merchants," she said during an emergency meeting, "the neighbors, the artisans, the people from the neighborhood. They've trusted me for years. They've watched the flower shop grow. They've witnessed our relationship. Maybe they don't have millions, but they have something more valuable: loyalty." "Grace, with all respect, what can a baker or a cobbler contribute to a crisis of this magnitude?" "Connections," she replied. "Network, community. Did you know that Mr. Johnson's cousin, the one from the corner diner, is director of an agricultural cooperative with more than 200 members? Or that Mrs. Washington's daughter works in the investment department at First Carolina Bank? Or that Martha's brother knows half the business council in Columbia?" Alexander looked at her with a mixture of amazement and hope he hadn't felt in weeks. "Are you suggesting we ask the downtown neighbors for help?" "I'm suggesting we stop looking for solutions in the same places we've always looked and start looking where no one has looked before." The strategy was risky, unorthodox, completely contrary to everything Alexander had learned in his years of business training. But it was also his only option. And Grace was right about something fundamental. Human connections, relationships built on trust and respect, were worth more than any formal contract. Over the following weeks, Grace mobilized her network of contacts with an efficiency that left Alexander's advisors astonished. Doors that seemed closed opened. Conversations that seemed impossible materialized. Small supports added up to form a safety net no one had anticipated. It wasn't enough to solve all the problems, but it was enough to buy time. Time to renegotiate debts, time to sell non-essential assets, Time to restructure what remained of the Bennett empire into something smaller but more solid. The cost was high. Sleepless nights, fights triggered by stress, moments when both doubted whether they could survive that storm. But each small victory brought them closer. Each obstacle overcome strengthened the bond uniting them. "Thank you," Alexander said one evening, when they could finally see light at the end of the tunnel. "Not just for the practical help, but for not abandoning me when everything was collapsing." Grace took his hand, feeling the calluses that had appeared on his palms after weeks of physical work helping with the most basic restructuring tasks. "I would never abandon you. Not in good times or bad. That's what it means to truly love someone. My father used to say character is revealed in crises. I think he was right, though in a way he never anticipated." "What do you mean?" "That in this crisis I've learned more about myself, about you, about what truly matters, than in 35 years of apparent success. And although I'd rather not have gone through this, I wouldn't change what we've built together for anything in the world." The moon shone over Charleston that night, illuminating the downtown streets where two people had found, in the midst of chaos, the certainty of a love capable of surviving any storm. The months following the crisis were an exercise in reconstruction, both business and personal. The Bennett empire had survived, though considerably reduced. Properties were sold, divisions closed, painful decisions made that affected entire families. Alexander carried the weight of each layoff, each closure, as if they were stones accumulating on his shoulders. Grace watched him with growing concern. The light that usually shone in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a shadow of guilt that no words seemed able to dispel. "You need to get out of here," she told him one morning, finding him in his office where he'd spent another sleepless night. "You need air, perspective, something other than numbers and bad news." "I can't leave now. There are too many things pending, too many decisions to make." "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to breathe." "One day, Alexander. Give me one day." He agreed more from exhaustion than conviction, letting himself be led without asking where they were going. Grace drove her small car along back roads until they reached a village lost in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place of stone houses and cobbled streets where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. "My mother used to bring me here when I was little," she explained as they walked through the deserted streets. "She said it was the perfect place to think, to put things in perspective." They sat on a stone bench in front of a centuries-old church, watching the midday sun bathe the whitewashed facades. "Why here?" Alexander asked. "Because here, far from everything, it's easier to see what truly matters." Grace pointed to a house on the corner, with geraniums in the windows and a wooden door worn by the years. "See that house? My great-grandmother was born there, more than 100 years ago. She was the daughter of a day laborer who worked in the tobacco fields. She had nothing, Alexander, no money, no education, no expectations of a better life." "And what happened?" "She met a man who repaired clocks in the next village over. They got married, had children. One of them was my Grandma Rose. She moved to Charleston, opened the flower shop, raised my mother. And my mother raised me." Grace paused, her eyes fixed on the ancestral house. 4 generations of women, each building on what the previous one left. Not million-dollar empires, not mansions or luxury cars. Just love, work, and the determination to make things a little better than before. Alexander felt something move in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to understand that a person's value isn't measured by the businesses they control or the money they accumulate. It's measured by the lives they touch, the seeds they plant, the love they leave behind. I've destroyed everything my family built for generations. No, Alexander, a con artist destroyed part of your assets. You saved what you could. You protected the people who depended on you. You demonstrated an integrity many in your position would have abandoned long ago. But, my father, your father is in a clinic, fighting his own battle. And if he wakes up someday, what he'll see won't be a reduced empire. He'll see a son who faced adversity with dignity, who didn't run when things got difficult, who found true love and had the courage to choose it over expectations. The tears Alexander had contained for weeks finally overflowed. He cried for his sick father, for the wounded company, for all the fears and doubts he'd accumulated since he was a boy trying to meet impossible expectations. Grace held him without saying anything, letting him release it all, being the refuge he needed in that moment. The mountain wind blew gently, bringing aromas of pine and wildflowers, of ancient earth and persistent life. When the tears were exhausted, Alexander looked up at his great-grandmother's house. "How did they do it?" he asked. "How did they find the strength to keep going generation after generation without giving up? I don't know for certain. But I believe the secret is remembering that each day is a new opportunity to plant seeds. Some will bloom, others won't. But if you stop planting, then you've truly lost." Alexander nodded slowly, feeling something rebuild inside him. "I want to plant seeds with you, Grace. I want to build something together, something that lasts beyond financial statements and economic crises. We're already doing it. Every day, every conversation, every moment we share. That's what will remain when everything else disappears." They returned to Charleston at sunset, with the sky painted in colors no palette could reproduce. Alexander looked at the landscape passing by the window with new eyes, seeing beauty where before he only saw numbers, finding hope where before there was only despair. The crisis wasn't over, the problems were still there, but something had fundamentally changed. He was no longer alone facing them, and that, he discovered, made all the difference. Alexander's transformation didn't go unnoticed by those around him. Associates who had known him as a ruthless executive now saw him making decisions that prioritized people over profits. Employees who had feared his meetings now found in him someone willing to listen. But the most significant change occurred in his relationship with Catherine. The matriarch had observed from a distance how her son navigated the crisis, how Grace's presence sustained him when everything seemed lost. And something in her, something that had remained closed for decades, began to open. The call came one March afternoon, when Charleston's dogwoods were beginning to bloom. "I need to see you," Catherine said without preamble. "Come to the estate and bring Grace." The drive to Beaufort was made in tense silence. Alexander didn't know what to expect. His mother was unpredictable even in her best moments. Grace, for her part, felt a mixture of apprehension and curiosity that kept her alert. They found Catherine in the garden, sitting on a stone bench under the oldest live oak on the property. She seemed smaller than Grace remembered, as if the past months had taken an invisible toll. "Sit down," she indicated, gesturing to the bench across from her. "I have things to say, and I don't want interruptions." Alexander and Grace obeyed, exchanging a look of uncertainty. 47 years ago, I married your father," Catherine began, looking at her son. "Not for love, as you probably know. It was an arrangement between families, a transaction designed to consolidate empires. Nobody asked if I agreed. Nobody considered I might have other dreams." She paused, her eyes losing themselves in some point on the horizon. "There was a man, before your father, a musician who played saxophone in the jazz clubs of Savannah. I fell in love with him with the passion of youth, with that absolute certainty that love conquers everything." Alexander felt the world stop. He'd never heard his mother talk about anything remotely personal, much less about a love before his father. "What happened?" Grace asked, her voice soft as a caress. "What always happens in families like ours? They gave me a choice, him or my future. If I chose him, I'd lose everything, the inheritance, the family, the position, and Catherine's voice broke slightly. "I chose security. I chose what was expected of me. Mother, you never told me, because I was ashamed, Alexander. Ashamed of having been a coward, of having sacrificed love for money. And for 47 years, I convinced myself I'd made the right decision. That romantic love was a fantasy of foolish youth." Catherine turned to Grace, and for the first time, she saw tears in the matriarch's eyes. "When I met you, I despised you. Not for who you were, but for what you represented. Living proof that my choice had been wrong. If my son could choose love over duty, then everything I'd sacrificed had been in vain." "Mrs. Bennet, let me finish." Catherine breathed deeply. "These past months, watching how you faced the crisis together, how your love didn't waver when the money disappeared, how you, Grace, held him when he was falling, I finally understood what I'd lost so many years ago. She stood with effort, approaching Grace until she stood before her. I owe you an apology. For the times I looked at you with disdain, for the obstacles I put in your path, for the pain I caused you both with my bitterness disguised as maternal protection. Grace stood, taking Catherine's wrinkled hands in hers. I don't need apologies, Ma'am. I only need to know you accept what your son and I have. I accept it, and more than that, I celebrate it. Catherine looked at Alexander, who remained motionless, processing everything he'd just heard. Son, don't make the mistake I made. The empire, the money, the family name, all of that can disappear in an instant. But true love, when you find it, is the only thing that truly matters. The embrace that followed was the first genuine one between mother and son in over 30 years. Grace stepped away discreetly, giving them space for a reconciliation that had taken decades to form. When they finally separated, Catherine wiped her tears with an embroidered handkerchief that seemed to have its own story. There's something else, she said. I've made a decision. I'm going to donate a significant portion of my personal assets to a foundation supporting families in crisis. And I want you, Grace, to be part of the board of directors. Me? But I have no experience in... You have something more valuable: compassion, integrity, and the ability to see people beyond their circumstances. Those are qualities money can't buy. Grace looked at Alexander, seeking his reaction. He smiled, a smile that said more than 1,000 words. My mother's right. There's no one better for that role. That afternoon, in the family estate's garden, 3 people sealed a new beginning. The past couldn't be changed. Wounds wouldn't heal overnight. But for the first time, the future seemed bright, full of possibilities none of them would have imagined months before. Love, after all, had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. One only had to have the courage to let it in. Spring arrived in Charleston with an explosion of colors that seemed to celebrate new beginnings. The floral center Grace and Alexander had dreamed of finally opened its doors, transformed into something that exceeded all their initial expectations. On Inauguration Day, Grace stopped at the threshold, contemplating the space they'd created together. The greenhouse sparkled with orchids and exotic plants imported from 3 continents. The floral design workshop was equipped with everything needed for the classes that would soon begin, and the small cafe, with its view of the jasmine courtyard, already smelled of fresh coffee and pecan pie. It's more beautiful than I imagined, she murmured, feeling tears pool in her eyes. Martha appeared at her side, wearing the new apron they'd ordered specially for the occasion. Your grandmother would be crying with pride right now, and so would I, but someone has to keep their composure. The inauguration brought together an improbable mix of guests. Downtown neighbors who'd watched Grace grow up, business people from Alexander's circle observing everything with poorly disguised curiosity, local journalists who smelled a human interest story, and Catherine Bennett, seated in a place of honor, with an expression combining maternal satisfaction and entrepreneurial evaluation. Alexander spoke briefly, thanking everyone who'd made the project possible, but it was Grace who captured the attendees' attention, with a speech flowing directly from the heart. My Grandma Rose used to say that flowers are the words we use when words aren't enough, she began. They express love when our mouths are silent, console when hugs don't reach, celebrate when joy is too great to contain. She paused, scanning the space filled with people. This center isn't just a business. It's a dream that began 3 generations ago, in a small downtown shop where a woman decided beauty deserved to be shared. It's the continuation of a legacy of love, work, and perseverance that was passed to me as the most valuable gift I could receive. Her eyes found Alexander in the crowd and she smiled. And it's also proof that when 2 people commit to building something together, obstacles become stepping stones, storms become opportunities, and dreams become reality. The applause that followed was genuine, warm, charged with an emotion transcending the formality of the event. Grace felt her grandmother was there somehow, smiling from some invisible place. The following weeks demonstrated that the Floral Center wasn't just a dream come true, but also a commercial success. Floral design classes filled quickly, attracting everyone from neighborhood homemakers to event designers from across the Carolinas. The cafe became a meeting point for couples seeking a romantic atmosphere, and groups of friends enjoying afternoons of conversation among flowers. But beyond material success, what gave Grace the most satisfaction was seeing how the space became a place of healing. Women going through divorces found comfort in the gardening workshops. Lonely elderly people spent afternoons in the cafe, feeling they belonged to a community. Neighborhood children participated in free environmental education programs Grace had insisted on including. "You're changing lives," Alexander told her one evening as they closed after a particularly busy day. "You see that, don't you? I'm just sharing what my grandmother shared with me. Love for flowers, yes, but also the idea that we all deserve beauty in our lives, no matter how much money we have in our pockets. You're extraordinary, Grace Mitchell. I'm a downtown florist who had the luck to find someone willing to believe in her dreams. The luck was mine, and I knew it from the first moment I walked into your shop looking for flowers to remember." Grace approached him, wrapping him in her arms. "And did you succeed remembering what you were looking for?" "Better than that. I found something I didn't know I was looking for. A home." The kiss they shared among the sleeping flowers tasted of fulfilled promises, overcome obstacles, of a love that had proven stronger than all storms. Outside, the spring moon illuminated Charleston's downtown streets, the same neighborhood where 3 generations of women had woven a legacy of flowers and love. And now that legacy continued, enriched by a man who had learned that true wealth isn't counted in coins. The call came at dawn in May, when the jasmine was in full bloom, and Charleston's air smelled of promises. Grace woke to the sound of the phone and saw Alexander's face pass from confusion to disbelief in seconds. "What? When? Yes, I'm coming immediately." He hung up with trembling hands, turning to her with eyes shining with an emotion he couldn't name. "My father. He's awake." The trip to Atlanta was a blur of airports and taxis, calls to Catherine, who was already on her way, silences charged with hope and fear. 5 years. 5 years since Robert Bennett had fallen into a coma doctors didn't expect him to wake from. 5 years of visits to a clinic where a man slept, while the world kept turning without him. Alexander entered the room like a child, afraid of waking from a dream. His father was sitting up in bed, thinner than he remembered, his hair completely white now, but with eyes open and aware. "Dad," he whispered, and it was as if 35 years of emotional distance evaporated in that single word. Robert Bennett looked at his son with an expression mixing confusion and recognition. "Alexander," his voice was hoarse from years of silence, "you've grown." It was an absurd observation, given that Alexander had been an adult long before the accident, but it contained a deeper truth. The man before him wasn't the stressed executive he'd known, but someone gentler, more present. The doctors explained the awakening was a rare but not inexplicable phenomenon. Robert would need months of rehabilitation, perhaps years to fully recover his functions. But he was alive, he was conscious, and that was more than anyone had dared hope. Grace met Robert 3 days later, when his condition had stabilized enough to receive extended visits. Alexander had prepared her to find a formidable man, a patriarch whose shadow had dominated his entire life. But the man who received her was rather a humble survivor, someone who'd returned from a place few know. "So you're Grace," Robert said, studying her with eyes still showing signs of fatigue. "My wife has told me a lot about you." "I hope good things, sir. She told me you saved my son. Not his company, though, that too. You saved him from becoming what I was before this. Sleep." Grace didn't know what to answer. She looked at Alexander, who was watching the exchange with visible tension in his shoulders. "Your son didn't need saving," she finally said. "He only needed to remember who he really was, beyond expectations." Robert nodded slowly, as if those words confirmed something he'd suspected. "I spent 40 years chasing success that never made me happy," he murmured. "I built an empire and lost my family in the process. When I woke up, the first thing I thought was, what has become of my life? And I didn't like the answer. Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do, Alexander. I have to say this while I still can." Robert sat up with effort. "I was an absent father, a distant husband, a man who measured his worth in financial statements, and when I closed my eyes 5 years ago, I didn't know if my son loved me or feared me." Tears rolled down Alexander's cheeks without him doing anything to stop them, Now I see a man who chose his own path, who found true love, who had the courage to be different from me. And I'm proud, son. So proud it hurts my chest." The embrace between father and son was the first genuine one of their lives. Grace watched from a corner, feeling she was witnessing something sacred, a healing that had taken decades to arrive. Catherine entered quietly, stopping next to Grace. "I'd never seen them like this," she whispered. "Not even when Alexander was little." "Sometimes we need to lose ourselves to find ourselves," Grace replied. "And sometimes we need to almost lose someone to understand what truly matters." Catherine took her hand, squeezing it with a warmth that would have been unthinkable months before. "Thank you, Grace, for giving me back my family." "The family was always there, Mum. It just needed to remember how to love." The following months were of reconstruction in every sense. Robert progressed slowly in his rehabilitation, recovering strength and mobility with a determination that surprised his doctors. But more important than physical recovery was the emotional transformation the entire family was experiencing. Visits to Grace's floral center became part of Robert's therapy. The man who had run an empire from glass offices now found peace among flowers, learning plant names he'd never noticed, discovering a beauty that had always been there, but he'd never allowed himself to see. "My father and your grandmother would have been good friends," he commented one afternoon while helping Grace transplant begonias. They both understood the value of things that grow slowly. Life is like that, isn't it? We grow slowly, one day at a time, one decision at a time. And when we look back, we're surprised by how far we've come. Robert smiled, a smile Alexander swore he'd never seen on his father. "You're wise for your age, Grace, and my son is very lucky to have found you. The luck was mutual, Mr. Bennett, completely mutual." Summer arrived in Charleston with its usual intensity, but Grace barely noticed. The floral center was thriving beyond expectations. Classes were booked months in advance, and the cafe had become one of the neighborhood's best-kept secrets. But most important was the peace she'd found. The peace of knowing she'd built something meaningful, that she'd honored her grandmother's legacy, that she'd found a love surpassing everything she'd imagined possible. Alexander, for his part, had transformed what remained of the family empire into something completely different. The company no longer pursued growth for growth's sake, but focused on sustainable projects, investments generating social impact, a business model that would have horrified his predecessors, but made him feel, for the first time, proud of his work. It was on a July night, with the sky tinted with the oranges and pinks of Charleston sunset, that everything changed once more. Grace was closing the original flower shop, the small shop where it all began. Martha had already left, and the shop's silence was comforting after a busy day. She was arranging the last bouquets when she heard the door chime. Alexander entered with an expression she couldn't interpret, a mixture of nervousness and determination that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I thought you had a business dinner," Grace said, surprised. "I cancelled it. There's something more important." He approached her slowly, stopping by the counter where 15 months earlier they'd met. "Do you remember the first time I came here?" he asked. "I asked for flowers to remember, and you prepared me an arrangement of white roses, wild rosemary, and jasmine. I remember. You said you wanted to remember something you thought you'd forgotten." I lied. Alexander smiled slightly. "I didn't want to remember anything. I wanted to find something I'd never had, something real, genuine, that couldn't be bought or negotiated." Grace felt her heart accelerate. "And did you find it?" "I found you." Alexander knelt, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket that he opened to reveal a ring. It wasn't ostentatious, not the type of jewelry magazines would associate with his name. It was a simple, elegant design, with a green stone that glowed under the dim sunset light. "It's an emerald," he explained. "The same green as the stems you were cutting that first morning, the same green as your eyes when you concentrate on your arrangements, the same green of new leaves representing beginnings." Grace couldn't speak, tears blurring her vision. "Grace Mitchell, in these 15 months, you've transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. You've taught me that love isn't measured in grand gestures, but in constant presence, that true wealth is in human connections, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it." He paused, his blue eyes fixed on hers. "Would you do me the honor of being my wife? Not because the world expects it, not because it's convenient, but because I can't imagine my life without you. Because every morning I want to wake up beside you. Every night I want you to be the last thing I see before closing my eyes. And every moment in between I want to build with you." Grace knelt before him, taking his face in her hands. "Alexander Bennett, since you walked through that door, you've challenged everything I thought I knew about love, about destiny, about who I could be. You've loved me when I didn't feel worthy of being loved. You've supported me when I doubted myself. You've given me a home when I thought I'd never find one." Is that a yes? It's the most absolute, most complete, most certain yes I've ever spoken in my life. The kiss they sealed was different from all the previous ones. It was a kiss of promises, of commitments, of a future opening before them like a garden to cultivate. When they finally separated, Alexander slipped the ring onto Grace's finger, and both contemplated how the emerald captured the last rays of Charleston's sun. "My grandmother used to say commitment is like planting a tree," Grace murmured. "At first it's fragile, needs constant care, protection from storms, but with time it grows roots so deep nothing can topple it." "Then let's plant our tree, Grace, and see what flowers it gives." Outside, night was falling over downtown Charleston, with its symphony of distant guitars and neighbors' laughter. Inside the small flower shop where it all began, two people celebrated the start of a new chapter, aware that true love isn't the end of the story, but the beginning of the greatest adventure of all. The South Carolina Low Country Estates garden was unrecognizable. Where there had once been rigid geometries and hedges trimmed with military precision, now bloomed a paradise of colors and aromas Grace had designed personally during the months of their engagement. The live oaks of the south wing, those Catherine had mentioned at their first meeting, shone with renewed health, their leaves an intense green proclaiming the place's transformation. Jasmine climbed the whitewashed walls, rose bushes alternated with gardenias, and in the garden's center, a new pond reflected the afternoon sky like a liquid mirror. It was here, under an arch of white flowers, Martha had spent 3 days preparing, where Grace and Alexander were about to become husband and wife. The guests formed an improbable tapestry of worlds that had refused to mix for generations. Business people in impeccable suits sat beside downtown neighbors who'd come in their Sunday best. Charleston's high society shared space with market merchants who'd known Grace since she was a braided child helping her grandmother. Robert Bennett, now walking unaided though with an elegant cane, occupied a place of honor beside his wife. The man who'd slept 5 years had become one of the most enthusiastic defenders of the family's transformation, finding in his new life a peace he'd never known in his empire years. Catherine, dressed in a blue silk suit that had belonged to her own mother, observed the preparations with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. On the other side of the aisle, Grandma Rose's portrait, silver-framed and adorned with fresh jasmine, presided over the ceremony as the absent godmother both knew she was. The music began, a guitar playing a melody Grace had heard 1,000 times in downtown Charleston patios. Alexander waited under the flower arch, eyes fixed on the point where she would appear, feeling his heart beat with an almost painful intensity. And then he saw her. Grace advanced on Martha's arm, who'd insisted on being the matron of honor to walk her down the aisle. Her dress was simple, southern lace that had belonged to her mother, altered for the occasion by neighborhood seamstresses who'd worked without charge as a wedding gift. She carried a bouquet of jasmine and white roses, the same flowers she'd prepared for Alexander that first morning that changed their lives. But what shone brightest was her smile. A smile containing all the world's joy, all gratitude for the journey traveled, all hope for the future opening before them. When she reached Alexander, they both took hands and looked at each other with an intimacy that made the attendees feel like intruders in a sacred moment. "You're stunning," he whispered. "You too," she replied, and both laughed softly. The ceremony was intimate and moving. The vows they exchanged weren't traditional, but words they'd written together, sitting in the flower shop's patio during nights of confessions and promises. "Grace," Alexander began, "I promise to love you not only on sunny days, but especially in storms. I promise to listen when words fail you, to support you when strength abandons you, and to celebrate you every day of our life together. I promise to be your companion, your confidant, your refuge and your greatest admirer. And I promise, above all, never to stop learning from you, because in these 15 months you've taught me more about life and love than in the previous 35 years. Grace breathed deeply, feeling tears threaten to overflow. Alexander, I promise to love you with the same intensity in abundance and scarcity, because I've learned true value isn't measured in possessions. I promise to be your anchor when the world becomes chaotic, your light when darkness surrounds you, and your home, no matter where we are. I promise to keep alive the curiosity that led me to you, the courage that allowed me to stay, and the faith that sustained me in moments of doubt. And I promise, each day, to choose you again, because true love isn't a feeling that happens, but a decision renewed with each dawn. The rings were exchanged, final words spoken, and when the officiant declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was sealed by the applause of a community that had witnessed their story from the beginning. The celebration that followed was a perfect party of the two worlds that had united. There was jazz and classical music, shrimp and grits and champagne, conversations in southern drawl and toasts in refined English. Neighborhood children ran between tables while executives discovered the pleasure of simplicity, and downtown ladies exchanged recipes with society women who'd learned to see beyond prejudices. At one point in the evening, Grace stepped away from the bustle and walked to the pond, where the full moon reflected like a second satellite. Alexander found her there, barefoot on the cool grass, her wedding dress slightly stained with dance floor dust. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, embracing her from behind. "About the path that brought us here, about all the times I could have chosen differently. You could have chosen differently. And about how each decision, each obstacle, each moment of doubt led us exactly where we needed to be. Do you have any regrets?" "None." She turned to look at him. "And you?" "Just one. Not finding you sooner." Grace laughed, that contagious laugh that had captivated Alexander from day one. "If you'd found me sooner, we wouldn't have been ready. The time we lived separately made us into the people who could love each other this way. Since when are you so wise? Since a very special grandmother taught me that flowers don't bloom before their time, no matter how much we water them. Everything has its moment, and our moment was this one." They stayed embraced under the moon, listening to music arriving from the party, feeling the breeze bringing the aroma of flowers Grace had planted with her own hands. "You know what excites me most about the future?" Alexander murmured. "What?" "Having no idea what's coming. My entire life, every step was planned, every goal defined. And now, for the first time, the future is a blank canvas we'll paint together." Grace looked up at the stars, remembering all the nights she'd spent alone in the flower shop's patio, wondering if she'd ever find her place in the world. "My grandmother used to say love is like a garden," she said. "It requires patience, dedication, and faith that what we plant today will bloom tomorrow. But above all, it requires the will to keep cultivating, even when storms threaten to destroy everything." "Then let's keep cultivating, Grace. Every day, every year, a whole life." "A whole life," and she repeated, and in those 3 words was contained all the promise of the future. They returned to the party hand in hand, ready to celebrate with the loved ones who'd been part of their story. The night continued with laughter and dancing, with toasts and embraces, with shared memories and dreams to fulfill. And when dawn began painting the sky pink and orange over the low country estate's rooftops, Grace and Alexander watched together as a new day was born, the first of many they'd build together. The garden around them awakened with birdsong and the perfume of jasmine. Somewhere a guitar played the last notes of a melody fading in the breeze. And in the heart of Charleston, in the downtown neighborhood where it all began, Rose's Flowers remained closed for a day, with a sign on the door that simply said, "Celebrating Love. Back tomorrow." Because that was, in the end, the essence of their story. Not a happy ending, but a promising beginning. Not the conclusion of a fairy tale, but the first chapter of a real life. With its joys and challenges, its certainties and doubts, but always, always, with the conviction that true love is worth cultivating. Grace rested her head on Alexander's shoulder as the sun finished rising, painting the world gold. "Ready for our adventure?" he asked. "Since the moment you walked into my flower shop looking for flowers to remember." And so, between jasmine and promises, two souls' destiny had decided to unite began together, the most beautiful of journeys. That of a shared life one day at a time, one flower at a time, one love at a time.